Most small studios nowadays are virtual, based around a computer running a DAW, digital audio workstation. Most or all of the mixing and processing is done digitally with the DAW's software mixer and plugins. But of course, there's always an analog component to every studio as well. Audio must be converted from digital data to analog waveforms to be played over studio monitor speakers and headphones. And while many instruments are purely digital, virtual instruments, synths, samplers, drums, etc., some must be recorded from analog sources. Acoustic and electric guitars and basses, and of course vocals, are the most common analog sources in music production, but often other physical instruments are incorporated into an otherwise virtual arrangement as well. And it's not uncommon, even for hardware digital instruments, like keyboard or drum workstations, to be incorporated into inside-the-box production, often requiring analog connections to get the audio into the DAW. But often instruments and voices, and audio playback, may not be the only analog elements in a production. Many engineers and mixers like to incorporate analog processing hardware into the virtual production process for the distinctive, warm character of hardware componentry, and to utilize unique processors that may not be available as plugins in software. We'll look at how this may be accomplished in DAW mixers. And some mixers prefer to mix primarily, or even exclusively, in the analog domain. The sound of individual tracks being mixed or summed together in a good hardware console, as well as the tactile experience of mixing with physical faders and controls, makes this a popular option, especially for those with the kind of high-end equipment that offers the best analog sound and feel. Until not long ago, some studios even still occasionally recorded on analog tape, again for the unique saturation and character tape provides. This practice has faded as the cost and availability of tape and the maintenance of the mechanical recorders has become more difficult to keep up with, not to mention the far greater ease of editing tracks recorded in a DAW. So nowadays, many studios are operated as hybrid studios, combining virtual software-based recording, editing, and mixing in the DAW with the use of analog sound sources and processing hardware, incorporating the best of both worlds. These hybrid digital plus analog studios range from primarily DAW-based production with a few analog elements to a mostly analog mixing environment with the DAW only handling recording and editing, to full hybrid workflows where mixing and processing is divided in varying degrees between virtual software, virtual instruments and plugins with mixing and automation done in the DAW's mixer, and hardware, physical instruments, and external processors. For those who may find themselves leaning toward a workflow that incorporates both software and hardware components, this course will take a look at these kinds of digital-analog hybrid studio setups. After a little beginner's background on the basics of the typical modern virtual studio, we'll look at several different takes on combining digital and analog software and hardware into a hybrid studio workflow. We'll start with a standard computer-based virtual studio, where the primary workspace is the DAW's virtual mixer that utilizes basic analog components, like front-end hardware for recording, some live instruments, and the occasional hardware processor in an otherwise virtual mix. We'll touch on the use of hardware synths and workstations as well, and the analog connections and hookup required to incorporate external devices into a DAW environment. We'll even look at the use of a small analog mixer in conjunction with a virtual software-based DAW production environment, which can offer some advantages and conveniences. Then we'll shift to a hybrid approach that uses an analog hardware mixer as the primary workspace, with the DAW strictly relegated to the role of multi-track recording and editing, with most or all of the mixing and processing done in the analog hardware domain. For those who are used to virtual mixing, we'll look at the signal routing that comes into play when mixing on a hardware console with external effects, like the setup and use of a patch bay to incorporate outboard processors in that hardware mix environment. And we'll wrap up with a look at a more integrated hybrid workflow, where mixing and processing may be done in both the DAW's virtual software mixer and the analog hardware mixer, combining plug-in processing with physical outboard gear, the technical and procedural considerations when utilizing both virtual and hardware mixing components. Next up, We'll get started with a little background for novice musicians and producers on the standard DAW-based virtual music production setups most common these days, before jumping into the incorporation of analog hardware in those studios.